Scary deep woods stories, shadows of Briarcliff Memorial Hospital. The wind howled like a wounded animal as Marcus Hale pulled up to the crumbling facade of Briarcliff Memorial Hospital, a long-abandoned facility nestled deep in the pine-choked outskirts of Fairbanks, Alaska. The building stood like a rotting carcass against the gray, snow-laden sky, its windows shattered, its rooftop half collapsed, and its welcome sign swinging wildly on rusted chains. Once the pride of the state's psychiatric care system, Briarcliff had been abruptly shut down in 1972 after a series of patient disappearances and an unexplained mass suicide of the night staff. No official report was ever released. Rumors spread quickly. Talk of experiments, demonic possession, or a sickness in the walls. But for Marcus, this was personal. His father, Dr. Joseph Hale, was the last known director of the hospital and vanished without a trace days before the shutdown. Now, decades later, Marcus had returned not just as a paranormal documentarian, but as a son desperate for answers. He stepped out of his snow-dusted SUV and adjusted the camera strapped to his shoulder. The cold was biting, but the silence was worse. Not even the crunch of boots in snow gave him comfort. He scanned the tree line, tall, skeletal pines swaying without sound, as though muffled by something unnatural. The hospital doors stood slightly ajar, gaping like broken teeth. As he approached, the temperature seemed to drop with each step. His breath fogged in front of him, thicker, heavier. He felt watched. Inside, the air was stale with mildew and something far fouler, something metallic, like blood that had never fully dried. The lobby was enormous, its ceiling half collapsed, exposing beams that hung like rib bones. Old patient files lay scattered across the floor, frozen solid. Wheelchairs and gurneys were overturned, many bearing deep claw-like gouges. Faded posters still clung to the walls. "Mental health is real health." Another one said, "Trust the treatment." Marcus clicked on his flashlight and panned it slowly across the room. The beam caught on a door marked "Archives," cracked open with a dark trail smeared across the floor. Dried blood or something darker. He followed it, his heart beat loud in his ears. The whispering started just as he reached the door. At first it sounded like wind through broken windows, but then it grew distinct, multiple voices overlapping, whispering his name. "Marcus, Marcus, he's waiting. Don't trust the light." He whipped around, but the lobby behind him was still. No footprints, no movement. Just the faint creak of something above him. He stepped into the archive room. Shelves towered in rows. Many collapsed or burnt. He ran his fingers along a file marked "Hale Joseph, Director." Inside, a single sheet of paper. On it, a typed note. "Patient 0 is awake. The protocol failed. Lock sub-level 3. Then a sudden crash. A metal tray behind him flung against the wall by an unseen force. He turned, shaking. The flashlight blinked once. In that split-second darkness, he saw a figure standing between the shelves, not moving, not breathing, just watching. When the light came back on, it was gone. But something new had appeared. On the wall, scrawled in fresh red, "He's still here." Marcus backed out of the room, heart pounding. He stumbled into the hallway, and the sound of heavy breathing began to echo from all directions. From the ceiling vents, the floor grates, the stairwell, breathing that wasn't his own. He lifted the camera, panning in every direction. Nothing. But then a flash. A silhouette sprinting past the hallway junction ahead. Human in shape, but impossibly fast. Marcus bolted toward it, turning the corner, only to find a stairwell door open, leading downward into the hospital's sublevels. On the wall beside it, etched deep into concrete, was a single word: "Bring him back." And in that moment, his flashlight flickered out completely. Darkness swallowed him whole. Marcus froze in the pitch-black stairwell, his breath loud and ragged, the silence pressing down on him like a heavy blanket soaked in dread. He fumbled with his flashlight, smacking it against his palm, and when the beam finally blinked back to life, it revealed walls smeared with fresh handprints, as if someone had been clawing to get out, or deeper in. The concrete steps beneath his boots creaked with each cautious descent as he moved downward, into the belly of Briarcliff, where no sunlight had touched in over 50 years. The deeper he went, the colder it became. Not like natural cold, but something ancient and predatory. The whispers began again, slithering around his ears like parasites, each voice more insistent than the last. Don't wake him. Turn back. You're already inside. He reached sublevel 3, the door at the bottom cracked slightly open, and as he pushed it with trembling fingers, it swung inward on rusted hinges, revealing a corridor bathed in emergency red lighting that pulsed like a heartbeat. The floor here was different, cleaner, preserved, as though time had been frozen. Security cameras blinked green despite the building's power supposedly being shut off for decades. A digital screen flickered above one of the sealed doors ahead, glitching between static and an image of a man strapped to a gurney, screaming silently. Marcus advanced slowly, camera recording, his breath fogging the air. The door marked Patient Zero was bolted shut with 6 iron locks, each etched with odd runes that shimmered faintly under the flashlight. The whispers intensified, now sounding like prayers or warnings, and the journal he carried, his father's journal, found hidden inside a wall at their childhood home, began to vibrate in his coat pocket. He pulled it out, flipping through pages filled with diagrams of the human brain, ritualistic symbols, and a repeated line scrawled frantically over and over. He is not what we thought. Suddenly, every light in the hallway flared violently, bathing the corridor in pure white, before exploding one by one in a strobe of glass and sparks. In that momentary chaos, Marcus saw them, figures, dozens of them, lining the corridor. Patients in hospital gowns with black holes where their eyes should have been, standing perfectly still. When the lights finally died and darkness reclaimed the hall, their presence lingered like a cold sweat down his spine. He turned to run, but the corridor behind him had changed. Walls warped, now covered in pulsating veins like the hospital itself was alive. The door he'd come through was gone, replaced with a blank, fleshy wall that breathed. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself forward toward a door that read, Observation Chamber. He entered and inside found a theater-like room overlooking a massive surgical floor. In the center, a slab bed, blood-stained, surrounded by machines and monitors still running. And there in the glass reflection, he saw his father, older, gaunt, eyes wide and sunken, standing beside the bed. Dad? Marcus whispered, spinning around. But no one was there. Only his own reflection and the chair behind the control desk slowly turning on its own. The monitors sparked to life, playing recordings dated 1971. His father's voice crackled through the speakers. The patient doesn't sleep. He doesn't age. We can't sedate him. I fear we've brought something through that was never meant to exist here. Marcus stared at the final video file. Its timestamp was from 2 weeks ago. Impossible. With shaking fingers, he played it. The screen showed the surgical room from above. The slab was empty, but the shadow on the floor, something massive and spider-like, moved independently. Then the camera flicked to the observation room itself. Real time. Marcus froze. The live feed showed him from above, standing in the exact position he was now. And behind him, a figure slowly rising from the floor, long limbs cracking into place, head tilting unnaturally. The power surged and everything went black. And in that darkness, the breathing returned. Closer now, right behind him. Marcus couldn't move. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but his legs remained rooted to the floor as the air behind him grew dense, heavy with the unmistakable presence of something ancient and unspeakably wrong. The sound of breathing was no longer merely audible. It pressed against his skin, warm and moist like the exhale of a creature far too large to occupy the space behind him. Summoning every ounce of courage, he pivoted in one swift motion, flashlight raised, but the beam revealed nothing but swirling dust motes and flickering shadows. Yet the breath remained. The camera he'd set down was still recording, its tiny red light blinking, and when he dared to glance at the display screen, what he saw made his blood freeze. The lens showed a figure standing directly in front of him, towering and skeletal, with elongated limbs, a head that seemed to float above a neck far too long, and eyes like gaping voids. But in reality, nothing. The room was empty to the naked eye. Marcus reached for the journal again, flipping to the pages he had ignored, and now saw drawings that matched the figure exactly, accompanied by frantic notes. He exists between frames. Do not look directly. And worst of all, he sees you when you see him. A high-pitched tone began to rise in the room, so loud it made his teeth ache. The glass window to the surgical floor began to crack, not from impact but as if reacting to the presence itself. Marcus grabbed the camera and stumbled backward into the hallway, the door slamming shut behind him with the force of a tomb sealing forever. The corridor had shifted again. The lights above were now ultraviolet, casting strange glows on the walls where symbols were bleeding through paint, symbols identical to those in the journal. He could hear voices now, not whispers but full sentences spoken in a chorus by dozens of mouths unseen. "The descent is nearly complete," they said in unison. And as Marcus turned a corner, he emerged into an operating theater unlike any he'd seen before. The room was circular, with curved stone walls instead of tile, and at its center was a mass of flesh, alive, breathing, embedded into the floor like a tumor. Above it hovered surgical tools suspended midair, unmoving yet humming with energy. The flesh pulsed with every breath Marcus took, as if syncing with him. He backed away slowly, but the walls began to rotate, revealing faces trapped beneath the surface. Former patients, maybe staff, their eyes wide and screaming silently, as though their very souls had been etched into the structure of Briarcliff itself. The camera started glitching violently, freezing on frames that showed glimpses of what Marcus could not see with his own eyes. Rituals, bloody altars, men in white coats carving symbols into their own skin, while something inhuman watched from the ceiling. The journal pages fell from his pocket and scattered on the floor. One landed face up, displaying a map of Briarcliff with a hidden section labeled "The Gate." That word triggered a memory, his father's last entry. "The gate is open now. God help us." Marcus ran, chasing the direction of the map, deeper into the maze-like halls of sub-level 3. The environment around him shifted more violently now. One corridor led into another that shouldn't exist. Rooms turned in on themselves, staircases leading upward that brought him back down, and clocks that spun counterclockwise. He found himself in what once might have been a chapel, though the crucifix had been replaced with a metallic sigil that throbbed with light. Candles lit themselves, and chanting began, though he was completely alone. He approached the altar and found a photograph. His father standing with several doctors, all of them in surgical masks and holding up a strange urn. On the back, a date, Briarcliff Ritual, June 6, 1966. Marcus stumbled backward as the chanting grew louder, and the floor beneath the altar opened with a hiss of escaping gas. Descending a rusted ladder, he entered the real Briarcliff, the one beneath the foundations. Here the walls dripped with black ichor, and the lights were replaced with faint glows from phosphorescent fungi growing in skull-shaped clusters. A sign hung loosely from corroded chains. "Containment Sector." The screams began again, rising in pitch, echoing through the tight corridor until Marcus reached a massive vault door with the word "Eater" scratched into its surface. He didn't want to open it. Every part of him knew that doing so would mean unleashing something meant to stay buried. But behind him, the hallway was folding in, the walls growing teeth, the floor becoming sticky like flesh. He had no choice. He turned the wheel, the metal screeching like the wail of the damned, and the door opened into a chamber where time felt frozen. At its center sat a humanoid figure, still and silent, made entirely of stitched-together bodies. Its head lifted slowly, mouth stretching into a grin, as a voice echoed directly into Marcus's skull. "Welcome home, son." Marcus felt his breath lock inside his chest, not from fear but from the oppressive weight of the voice that had just echoed in his mind. "Welcome home, son." The stitched-together thing before him didn't move, didn't breathe in the way a living creature should, but he could feel its awareness coil around him like smoke. The chamber itself was massive, the ceilings lost in darkness, and the floor beneath his feet was no longer tile but slick, pulsating muscle, warm and wet like the inside of something alive. His flashlight flickered and died completely this time, but the walls themselves began to glow with a faint bioluminescent red, as if responding to his presence, or worse, recognizing him. The stitched creature tilted its head, and slowly the grinning jaw began to open wider than should be anatomically possible. A sound leaked out, not a growl or a scream, but the sound of multiple children sobbing layered over the grinding of surgical saws. Marcus staggered back, stepping onto a patch of floor that gave way beneath him, dropping him through flesh and darkness into a hallway lit by swinging bulbs that sparked violently. He landed hard but didn't feel the pain, only the cold realization that he wasn't meant to find that room, and something was very, very aware that he had. The hallway he now stood in was lined with rusted gurneys and broken IV stands, and the air was thick with the smell of ammonia and rot. Footsteps echoed ahead of him, quick, light, as if someone barefoot were sprinting just out of view. Marcus ran after them, heart pounding, until he turned a corner and saw her. A little girl, no older than 7, dressed in a hospital gown soaked in blood from the knees down. Her eyes were sewn shut with black thread, yet somehow she turned directly toward him. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, but her mouth didn't move. The voice came from all directions. Marcus approached, but the hallway stretched before him like elastic, the girl pulling farther and farther away no matter how fast he ran. Doors lined the walls, some ajar, some sealed shut with chains, and from behind each came horrible sounds. Muffled screams, scratching, the wet sounds of meat being sliced. He burst through one door at random and found himself in a room that defied reality. It was his childhood bedroom, identical, down to the cracks in the ceiling and the Star Wars poster on the wall. Except this version was soaked in blood. His mother's favorite rocking chair moved slowly on its own. On the bed sat a VHS tape, labeled in handwriting he recognized as his father's. Briarcliff, Subject 34. Against his better judgment, he slid it into the rusted player beside the TV, which sparked but flickered on. The tape showed a patient strapped to a metal slab, surrounded by doctors en masse. One of them, tall and lean, removed his mask and turned to the camera. It was Marcus's father. "Test 34 begins," he said in a monotone, as the patient, unmoving, began to convulse. As Marcus watched, shadowy tendrils crawled from the subject's mouth, wrapping around the doctors, pulling them into the air. The camera fell, but before the tape cut to static, Marcus heard one chilling word spoken by his father: ascension. The TV exploded in sparks, setting the curtains ablaze, and as Marcus leapt away, the bedroom collapsed inward like paper melting in fire. He crawled back into the hallway, only now it was filled with figures standing silently along both walls. Doctors, nurses, patients, all with their faces turned toward him, eyeless sockets dripping black fluid. They didn't move, didn't speak, but as he passed them, each one's head turned to follow his movement. The further he walked, the more the walls pulsed like lungs inhaling and exhaling around him. He was deep inside the hospital now, not just physically, but spiritually, psychically bound to it in ways he didn't understand. A new sound emerged, a bell, low and metallic, ringing from somewhere deep below. It rang 13 times, and with each toll, the world seemed to flicker, like old film skipping frames. The eyeless people lining the halls began to weep, their mouths opening in silent screams. Marcus broke into a sprint and found a staircase descending further than it had any right to go. He took it, descending level after level until the air became thick and hot, every breath feeling like he was inhaling steam from boiling flesh. At the final landing, a gate stood before him made entirely of bone, fused and twisted into a barrier with symbols carved into each femur and skull. His hand moved on its own, touching the sigil at the gate's center, and it opened without resistance. He stepped into a cathedral carved from the earth, filled with rows of pews made of hospital beds and a massive operating table in place of an altar. Surrounding the table were robed figures, chanting in tongues older than language. One turned to him. It was the girl again, her eyes still sewn shut, but her voice was older now, aged like broken wood. "You're the offering," she said. The chanting stopped. All the figures turned to him and slowly removed their hoods. Each face was his own. Versions of him, aged differently, scarred, screaming, smiling, some with no mouths at all. The one closest to him held a surgical knife and gestured toward the table. Marcus backed away, but the ground beneath him lifted, pushing him toward the altar. The air was alive with energy, time bending, light bleeding backwards. His mind flooded with images, his father's experiments, rooms filled with black smoke, creatures crawling out of mirrors, children being fed to something beneath the floor. The journal had mentioned none of this. It had only scratched the surface. He was never here to investigate. He was here because he was meant to complete what his father started. The robed version of himself raised the knife, and in unison, all the voices, his voices, spoke. The host has returned. Then the knife came down. Marcus did not die. He expected pain, expected steel carving through his flesh. But instead the blade passed through him like smoke, and he was consumed not by death, but by something worse. Memory. Not his own. He was plunged into visions, raw and scorching, yanked violently into the consciousness of something ancient and buried beneath Briarcliff Memorial Hospital. He saw the foundation being laid in 1894, watched as the stones were blessed in a false ritual, not to protect the land but to bind it, to seal in something that had already been there long before the builders arrived. He saw men in black suits exchanging blood for bricks, sacrificing goats and infants beneath the hospital floor. And he saw his father, Dr. Philip Hargrove, not aging across decades, standing unchanging from 1973 to 2001, kept youthful by a pact whispered in a dead language to the entity in the pit. The entity had no form, no name, only hunger. It had waited, latched to the souls of the dying, whispering to the insane, feeding on the despair of every patient who had ever passed through Briarcliff's rusted gates. And now it wanted Marcus, not to kill him, to use him. He snapped back into his body with a scream, sprawled across the altar as the robed versions of himself dissolved into ash, as if the vision had burned them away. Alone again, his body trembling, Marcus climbed down from the blood-slicked table. The cathedral room was gone. He now stood in a corridor lined with black mirrors, each one taller than a door, stretching endlessly in both directions. He turned to go back, but the door he'd entered through was no longer there. Only the mirrors. The moment he took a step forward, the mirrors changed. They began to reflect not him, but scenes from different timelines. One mirror showed a version of him as a patient, restrained and screaming as his father injected something thick and black into his veins. Another showed him lighting the hospital on fire, eyes wild, laughing manically as the walls burned. Another showed him old in a wheelchair, whispering to a dark shadow hovering behind him. He touched one mirror, and his hand was yanked through like water. Suddenly, he was watching a surgery, his father, young and alert, operating on a patient while whispering to someone just outside the operating room light. Marcus strained to see who, and as the patient's chest was cracked open, black veins coiled out, crawling across the ceiling. Then the vision vanished, and he was standing alone in a hospital waiting room. But everything was wrong. The furniture was arranged in impossible geometries, chairs upside down on the ceiling, yet not falling, reception desks melting like wax. The patients in the room turned slowly. They all had his face, every single one. Each Marcus version stood up, bleeding from the eyes, approaching him with dragging limbs and convulsing motions. One by one, they began to chant something under their breath, something guttural and ancient, and as they drew close, Marcus screamed and ran through the nearest door. He found himself in the maternity ward, its lights flickering, the walls covered in children's handprints smeared in dark crimson. Cries echoed down the hallway, newborns but twisted, malformed. From one of the rooms, he heard a lullaby playing on a broken music box. He crept toward it and saw a woman in a tattered nurse's uniform, rocking a bundle in her arms. Her skin was gray and rotted, her lips stitched shut, but her eyes burned with lucid hatred. She turned slowly and held out the bundle to Marcus. Against every screaming instinct, he looked. Inside the blanket was a mirror, and in that mirror, he saw a new vision, himself, standing in front of Briarcliff, eyes black, welcoming new patients through the gates. He dropped the bundle and ran. Doors warped around him, rearranging, creating a shifting labyrinth that pulled him into the psychiatric ward. The walls here were alive, covered in twitching flesh, and faces pressed through from the other side, silent, screaming. An overhead speaker crackled on. It was his father's voice. Subject 35 has accepted the transmission. Integration has begun. The wall shuddered. Marcus's veins burned. Something was inside him now. Something old, something intelligent. He reached the nurse's station, now a pulsing, heart-like mass with phones growing from it like tumors. One rang. He answered. No voice, only static. Then a child's voice whispered, "Stop fighting." It hurts. Suddenly, he was inside a patient's cell, with no idea how he'd gotten there. The door was gone. The walls were scribbled with charcoal drawings, spirals, diagrams, something that looked like an eye inside a sun. In the corner, a figure stood facing the wall. As Marcus moved closer, the figure turned slowly. It was his mother, but her eyes were gouged out, and she wept black tears. You should have never come back, Marcus, she moaned. He never stopped looking for you. She lunged forward, but he blinked, and she was gone. He pounded the wall, screamed, and it collapsed outward like paper, leading him into a surgical theater filled with rows of ghostly doctors. They observed him silently, their eyes glowing under transparent skin. A surgical table waited in the center, and hovering above it was a writhing black mass, part shadow, part organ, whispering in tongues. The doctors moved toward him. One held a tray with surgical tools. Bone saws, rib spreaders, blades carved from teeth. They grabbed him, not physically, but with gravity itself, pulling him to the table as if fate had hands. Ascend, they whispered. Become. Marcus fought, screamed, but his limbs moved without his command. The entity above him split open like a blooming flower, revealing hundreds of red eyes and a gaping hole that led into nothingness. As they forced him back, the lights exploded, and for a moment, silence. Then he awoke on the floor of the hallway, alone, covered in sweat and blood. A number was written on the wall in black ink, 6 of 12. He had no idea what it meant, but the corridor ahead of him stretched into darkness, and he knew there was no turning back. Something was guiding him deeper into the hospital, something waiting, something patient, and it had already begun to change him. Marcus staggered to his feet, his pulse thundering in his ears, the number 6 of 12 still fresh in his mind like a countdown, carved into his fate. The hallway before him pulsed faintly, its flickering lights casting warped shadows that seemed to twitch and coil like snakes when he wasn't looking directly at them. The silence was heavy, pregnant with the weight of something unseen that hovered just outside perception, watching, waiting. He moved forward, each step echoing like a scream in the stillness. As he passed shattered wheelchairs and overturned gurneys, he caught glimpses of movement in the corners of his eyes. Faces pressed against glass panels, limbs reaching through vents. But when he turned to confront them, nothing remained but darkness. Ahead, a doorway stood ajar, leaking a dull orange glow that pulsed like a dying heartbeat. Drawn by instinct more than logic, Marcus stepped through and found himself inside what had once been the hospital's chapel. Rows of pews, blackened by fire, lined the room, and the altar at the far end was split in half by something that looked like claw marks, deep and wide enough to have been carved by a creature the size of a bear. Above the altar, a crucifix still hung, but the figure of Christ was missing, replaced by a grotesque humanoid shape stitched together from hospital linens and surgical tubing, its face made of dozens of patient ID tags. As Marcus stepped closer, the stitched effigy began to twitch. Blood poured from its seams. A low moaning rose from the floor, and he looked down to see that the tiles were actually skulls, fused together, their mouths opening and closing silently in agony. The air turned thick, heavy with the smell of iodine and rot. Suddenly, the stained glass windows exploded inward, not with force, but with silence. Shards floating midair, frozen, shimmering, then vanishing as if erased from existence. From behind the altar, a woman emerged. She wore a nurse's uniform, but her face was obscured by a surgical mask sewn into her flesh. She didn't speak. She only lifted a bony hand and pointed at Marcus. And with that gesture, the entire chapel convulsed. Pews twisted into vines of rusted metal, wrapping around him, trying to drag him down. He tore free, stumbling into a back corridor that hadn't been there before, one lined with iron doors and warning signs in ancient dialects. The corridor was impossibly long and seemed to sink the deeper he walked, the air growing colder with every step. He passed a window and saw the hospital grounds outside, only they were upside down, the sky a churning vortex of ash and flame. His reflection in the glass did not match his movements. It was grinning, eyes jet black, teeth like needles. He broke into a run, the hallway stretching, elongating unnaturally, until finally a heavy vault door appeared before him. It was marked with the word inoculum in red paint, pulsing like a wound. A keypad blinked, demanding a 6-digit code. Marcus didn't know the code, but his fingers moved anyway, pressing numbers without conscious thought. 193842. The door hissed open. Inside, he found a laboratory frozen in time. Rusted surgical instruments hung from the ceiling like wind chimes. Dissected corpses lay on gurneys, suspended in plastic wraps filled with dark fluid. One of the bodies opened its eyes and mouthed his name. Monitors flickered to life, showing footage of him as a child, locked in a cell, surrounded by drawings he didn't remember making. Each one of Briarcliff, years before he'd ever been there. He stumbled back, his head spinning. Suddenly he heard music, a soft, haunting lullaby echoing from behind a curtain at the far end. He pushed it aside and found a room filled with hundreds of dolls, all dressed like doctors and nurses. In the center sat a massive porcelain doll, half its face broken off, revealing gears and wires beneath. It slowly turned its head toward him. "Subject 35 has passed phase 6, it whispered in a voice that sounded like metal scraping bone. The wall split open, not figuratively, literally. Flesh peeled back to reveal a long shaft plunging straight down into the earth. Stairs spiraled into the void, and Marcus, shaking, knew he had to descend. Each step downward made his bones ache as if gravity were growing heavier. Whispers followed him, his mother, his younger self, the voice of the entity he'd glimpsed in the surgical theater. At the bottom, he emerged into a chamber bathed in red light. It was filled with rusted cages, each containing a person. Some screamed, some whispered, some simply stared into the dark. One cage door swung open. Inside sat a man in a straitjacket. He looked exactly like Marcus, only older, with sunken eyes and teeth missing. "You shouldn't have come this far," the man said. "It's feeding now. You opened too many doors." Before Marcus could respond, alarms blared and the walls began to collapse inward, revealing tendrils of shadow writhing like snakes. The copy of himself dissolved into smoke. Marcus ran, dodging the grasping shadows until he found a trap door beneath a pile of bones. He threw it open and dropped through, landing hard in what looked like a 1950s kitchen, complete with ticking clocks and floral wallpaper. But outside the windows, nothing existed, just static, like a broken television screen. The table was set for dinner, plates of raw meat, still twitching. Sitting at the table were more copies of himself, each one older, more monstrous, with missing eyes, cracked skin, and voices like echo chambers. One of them smiled and said, "Welcome home." Marcus backed away as they rose from their chairs, moving in unison, chanting something that made his ears bleed. He crashed through another door and found himself in the pediatric ward, where the laughter of invisible children chased him down a hallway, painted with murals that changed when he blinked. One moment, innocent drawings, the next depictions of massacres and surgical torture. A single door at the end bore his name. He opened it. Inside, the room was empty save for a hospital bed, and on it lay a small figure covered in a white sheet. Marcus approached slowly, the sheet rising and falling with breath. He pulled it back and saw himself as a child, pale, eyes closed, a smile on his lips. Suddenly, the child's eyes snapped open, black and endless, and whispered, "It's almost done. You just have to remember." The room shattered like glass, and Marcus was falling, endlessly, until he landed with a crash in an underground morgue. He was alone, or so he thought. Dozens of body drawers slid open around him, each one empty, except he could feel them crawling closer. A shadow passed over the room, and a voice he hadn't heard in years, his father's voice, called out from the darkness, "One more gate, Marcus. Just one more." And then a countdown began to echo around him. 7 of 12. He screamed, but no one was there to hear it. The hospital pulsed with life. It was waking up, and it wanted him whole. Marcus's breath came in ragged gas as the cold morgue swallowed him whole, its shadows thick and suffocating. The drawers around him began to creak open simultaneously, revealing not bodies but distorted reflections of himself, each twisted by fear, rage, and despair, their hollow eyes pleading silently for release. The floor beneath his feet seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, vibrating in rhythm with the distant, maddening chant that now filled the air. His mind screamed to run, but his legs refused to obey, rooted by a force older than reason. Suddenly, a whisper slithered through the darkness, promising truths hidden beneath layers of pain and time. Promises wrapped in riddles only the damned could decipher. Compelled by a mixture of terror and curiosity, Marcus followed the voice down a narrow, spiraling staircase that had appeared where the morgue floor once was. Each step echoed like a death knell, descending deeper into the abyss of Briarcliff's haunted core. At the bottom, he found himself in a cavernous chamber carved from raw stone, lit by flickering candles that cast grotesque shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and decay. In the center stood a colossal mirror, framed by rusted surgical instruments, its surface swirling like liquid glass. Hesitating, Marcus reached out, and the mirror rippled, pulling him into a reflection of the hospital, twisted and nightmarish, where every corridor led to another hellish scene of suffering and madness. He was both observer and prisoner, trapped in a labyrinth of his own fears and the hospital's dark history. Faces of past patients and tormented staff flickered in and out, their screams blending into an unending cacophony. Suddenly, the mirror cracked, and shards exploded outward, piercing his skin and flooding his veins with visions of Briarcliff's deepest secrets. Forbidden experiments, tortured souls trapped between worlds, and a malevolent presence feeding on pain and fear. Overwhelmed, Marcus collapsed to his knees as the chamber began to tremble violently. The walls cracked open, revealing an endless void filled with whispering voices promising salvation if only he surrendered. Battling despair, Marcus forced himself up, determined to escape the hospital's grasp. The mirror reformed into a portal, and with a final, defiant breath, he stepped through, only to find himself back in the decaying hospital lobby. The eerie silence replaced by the distant sound of footsteps and the chilling realization that his nightmare was far from over. Marcus stumbled forward, heart pounding, as the cold, decaying lobby of Briarcliff stretched endlessly before him, warped and impossible. The faint echo of footsteps grew louder, but no one was in sight, only the flickering, failing lights casting grotesque shadows on peeling wallpaper, stained with age and neglect. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what he had just experienced in that haunted chamber, the mirror's visions clawing at his sanity. Suddenly, the floor beneath him groaned and shifted, splitting open to reveal a staircase spiraling downward into blackness. Without thinking, Marcus descended, each step colder, heavier, as if the weight of the hospital's tormented past pressed down on him. At the bottom, he entered a vast underground theater, the walls lined with faded photographs of patients and doctors, their eyes following him accusingly. In the center, a lone figure sat under a spotlight, a woman in a tattered nurse's uniform, her face obscured by shadows. Her voice was a whisper and a scream all at once as she recounted Briarcliff's darkest experiment, a procedure meant to trap souls forever, binding their pain to the hospital's walls. Suddenly, the seats filled with ghostly apparitions, their anguished faces twisted in silent screams. The woman extended her hand toward Marcus, her eyes glowing with unnatural light. He recoiled as the ground trembled, walls closing in, and the voices of the trapped souls rose in a deafening chorus. Desperate, Marcus fled the theater, running through endless corridors that shifted and changed with every turn. Doors slammed behind him, faces appeared and vanished in mirrors, and chilling laughter echoed from nowhere. He realized that Briarcliff was alive, a malevolent entity feeding on fear and suffering, and he was its prey. Gathering every ounce of courage, Marcus sought a way out, But with each step, he felt himself sinking deeper into a nightmare where time and reality bent, and escape seemed impossible. Marcus's breath hitched as the corridors twisted around him like a living maze, each turn revealing new horrors more vivid than the last. Walls oozed with dark, viscous fluid that pulsed like a heartbeat, and whispers morphed into anguished screams that clawed at his mind. Desperately searching for an exit, he found a door marked with peeling letters spelling chapel. Pushing it open, he stepped into a dimly lit room where shattered stained glass windows cast fragmented rainbows onto the cracked floor. At the center stood an altar draped in tattered white cloth, stained with rust and something darker. Suddenly, the air grew thick with cold, and a chilling presence filled the chapel. From the shadows emerged a figure, an old priest, gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow pits of sorrow and madness. He began to speak in a low, haunting chant that reverberated through the room, telling Marcus of the hospital's darkest secret, a ritual performed decades ago to imprison a malevolent spirit bound to feed on the souls of the patients. As the priest chanted, ghostly hands reached out from the walls, grasping at Marcus's limbs, trying to drag him into the shadows. Fighting with every ounce of strength, he broke free and fled the chapel, the screams of the trapped souls following him like a thunderstorm. The corridors now shifted faster, the hospital itself becoming a nightmare realm where reality twisted and fractured. Marcus stumbled into a room filled with old patient records and diaries, their pages revealing stories of cruel experiments and disappearances. Suddenly, a chilling realization dawned. These spirits were not just victims, but prisoners trapped in an endless cycle of torment. And somewhere deep within Briarcliff lay the key to their release, or his own destruction. Heart pounding, Marcus steeled himself to descend further into the hospital's bowels, determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant confronting the darkness that lurked at its core. Marcus pushed open a heavy steel door, its hinges screaming in protest, revealing a vast subterranean chamber, bathed in an eerie, unnatural glow. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and something far fouler, decay mixed with a suffocating sense of dread that pressed down on his chest like a weight. In the center of the chamber lay an operating table, stained dark and surrounded by rusted surgical tools arranged meticulously, as if waiting for some horrific procedure to resume. As Marcus's eyes adjusted, shadowy figures began to materialize, patients long dead, their faces twisted in agony, their silent screams frozen in time. From the far corner emerged a figure cloaked in white, face obscured by a cracked porcelain mask, moving with unnatural jerks, as if animated by a cruel puppeteer. Marcus realized this was the doctor, the architect of Briarcliff's nightmare, whose forbidden experiments had unleashed the malevolent force that haunted the hospital's halls. The doctor's voice was a cold whisper, recounting his obsession with transcending death, willing to sacrifice any soul to achieve immortality. Suddenly, the operating table glowed red, and the ghosts of his victims surged toward Marcus, their cold hands reaching to drag him into their eternal torment. Summoning every ounce of willpower, Marcus dodged and sprinted toward a narrow passageway leading deeper into the darkness. Behind him, the anguished wails crescendoed, shaking the very foundations of the hospital. The passage twisted and turned, filled with spectral traps and illusions designed to break his spirit. Yet driven by a burning need for answers and survival, Marcus pressed onward, knowing that the final confrontation with the dark heart of Briarcliff awaited, and that escaping alive might be impossible. Marcus's legs burned as he sprinted through the narrow, twisting passage, the echoing screams of the tormented souls close behind him. The air grew colder, each breath forming icy clouds that clung to his throat like chains. Suddenly, the walls began to close in, narrowing the path until it was barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. Panicked, he pushed forward, feeling the cold fingers of unseen entities brush against his skin, whispering curses and warnings in languages long forgotten. Ahead, a faint light flickered, a glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness. Driven by desperation, Marcus lunged toward it and found himself in a vast chamber lined with ancient symbols carved into stone, glowing faintly with an otherworldly energy. At the center stood a pedestal holding a weathered, leather-bound book, the hospital's forbidden tome, said to contain the ritual that could free the trapped souls or doom them forever. As Marcus reached for the book, the air exploded with chilling laughter as the malevolent force that had consumed Briarcliff manifested. A towering shadow with eyes like burning coals, its presence radiating pure malice. The creature lunged, and Marcus barely dodged, clutching the tome and reciting the ancient incantation with trembling lips. The chamber trembled as the spirits of the damned erupted from the walls, their cries turning to howls of rage and desperation. A violent battle of wills ensued, light clashing with shadow, hope fighting despair. Summoning every ounce of courage, Marcus forced the dark entity back, the hospital shaking violently as the malevolence screamed and began to dissolve into nothingness. Exhausted but triumphant, Marcus collapsed to his knees, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly as dawn's first light filtered through cracks in the stone. He knew the nightmare was not entirely over, but for the first time, there was hope, for the souls trapped in Briarcliff, and for himself. Marcus lay on the cold stone floor, his body trembling with exhaustion and the remnants of the nightmare that had nearly claimed him. The oppressive darkness that had shrouded Briarcliff Hospital was lifting, but the eerie silence that replaced the screams felt almost worse, an unsettling calm before the final storm. As he struggled to rise, the flickering light from the cracked ceiling revealed faint shapes swirling in the air, whispers of the souls he had freed, their translucent forms shimmering with gratitude and sorrow. They drifted past him, silent blessings on their long-awaited passage to peace. Yet beneath the surface, a chilling truth gnawed at Marcus's mind. The malevolent force might be weakened, but it was not destroyed. Briarcliff was a living entity, a vessel of torment and secrets, and somewhere deep within its walls, darker shadows stirred, waiting for the moment to reclaim their power. Gathering his remaining strength, Marcus stumbled toward the hospital's exit, each step echoing through the empty halls that had witnessed decades of suffering. Outside, the first rays of dawn pierced the thick mist hanging over the decaying building, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. As he emerged into the cold morning air, Marcus vowed to expose the horrors hidden within Briarcliff, to ensure that its dark legacy would never claim another soul. But even as he disappeared into the fading fog, a faint whisper lingered on the wind, a promise that the hospital's story was far from over, and that some nightmares never truly end.